All right, so today what we will do is cover lease submission documentation. These are documents that are required for lease submission. This is related to the housing placement and leasing process that is in CaseWorthy. The information that is here will only pertain to the lease submission sub-process. If you are interested in watching or learning more about the housing unit inspections form, please review our training on housing unit inspections. With that, I'm going to get started. My name is Aziza Nassar. I will be your instructor today for this training. The documentation checklist details will outline two main sections: the required lease documents as well as required landlord documents. What I'll do is I will cover each one of the four required lease documents in its entirety and highlight some key areas that you should look out for, and then we will talk about landlord documentation. Now, we'll go ahead and get started. The first document that is required is the fully executed lease with the VAWA addendum. These are two separate documents but are required to be submitted together. The first document is the fully executed lease. So with that, what you will see on your screen here is a sample lease rental agreement. This is a sample lease that we have completed just so that we can cover some key areas that will be required upon submission of the lease. So immediately what you will notice is that here the things that are color-coded in red are required, and then there are some things that are highlighted in kind of an orangey color. The required documentation or data fields that a fully executed lease should have are lease start and end date. So here you'll notice in the terms, you'll notice that here this is the lease start date and the lease end date. For all rental agreements that we approve, they need to be always a period of 12 months. The lease start date does not have to start at the beginning of the month. However, the lease end dates should always end at the end of a month. Next, we'll also need client's name. So the client's name should be on the rental agreement form as the tenant. Additionally, the client's address and unit number should be listed, as well as the landlord name. What you'll notice here is we also need to have explicit rent amount information. So the rent amount information should not be the subsidy amount or the tenant portion. This is what the market rate rent amount per this rental agreement. So you see this $900. This is a fake lease. I just pointing this out. Additionally, the lease must always detail utility responsibilities, and this is a key area where we often see landlords miss this. However, if the resident is required to pay any utilities, those utilities must be included on the lease itself. If the client is not responsible for the utilities, they can include an NA when your client and landlord complete this document. Additionally, if there are other fees like security deposits, those also need to be included on the lease. Signatures by both client and landlord are also required. Moving along to the VAWA addendum, the VAWA lease addendum is also a document that needs to be uploaded with the fully executed lease. Here you'll notice a marked up document or sample of the VAWA lease addendum. And what you'll notice at the top here is the tenant or the client information needs to be filled in, as well as the landlord and the full unit address and unit number. The addendum effective date must match the lease start date. So here, this effective date is the beginning of the lease date. So you'll want to make sure that this start date matches whatever is written here on the lease as the start date. Now, the other thing to note about the VAWA lease addendum is that signatures by both the client or the tenant and the landlord are required, as well as dates. And these dates do not have to match each other, but they are both required. So you want to make sure that both the landlord and the tenant are putting in the dates here. All right, moving us back into the checklist. The current proof of income or no income. For clients with income, one of these options is required. So any form of proof that will indicate a month's worth of income is sufficient. Here are some examples. So check stubs, they must be dated within the last 90 days and they must be at 1 month's worth based on the programmatic guidelines. So definitely check in with your program team to see if there are specifics around what would be considered sufficient. Tax forms such as the W-2 form, and if your client is on Social Security, a statement letter would also work. So one of these, not all of them, just one of these would work to show clients proof of income if they do have income. Now for clients without income, there are 2 documents that are required. There is the AFC income self-verification form, which I'll go over in a second, but also a current letter from Social Security Administration verifying no income is required. So this would be obtained from the Social Security Administration office, verifying that the client is not receiving any sort of Social Security disability or SSI benefits. Let's take a look at that that form, the AFC self-verification form. So this is what the form looks like. The form is just a simple form with client's first, last name, Social Security, date of birth, and the county, in which case all of the different income sources need to be verified that there is no income, as well as the client's signature and the case manager or staff signature is required. We did complete a mock-up of this form to highlight some very important notes and areas where we see a lot of revisions needed. So here you'll see a copy of the income self-verification form. The things that are highlighted here is you want to make sure that the client's last name and first name are completed, as well as the information below around Social Security, date of birth, and county. If a client does not have a Social Security, you can always enter zeros and we will assign them a number. Now, for income amounts, if this is for clients with no income, but if they do have income, they must disclose that here. Just as a note, supplemental nutrition assistance or SNAP is not an income source. It is crossed out. You do not need to report that as part of income. The other thing related to this form is you will need to have both signatures and dates here. So the client's signature as well as the case manager's signature as well as the dates. Let's go back to our checklist. Now, 2 new forms that we've officially just rolled out are the client participation agreement form as well as the rental assistance landlord contract. These 2 forms are brand new forms, but are going to be required for lease submission. The first one is the client participation agreement form. This form is basically an agreement form for the client to agree to participate in the program, and it covers 4 key areas. So eligibility expectations, rent and amounts payable. They will need to certify that they are in fact agreeing to participate and accept the terms, which will cover, and then also it will cover the housing discrimination and VAWA disclosure forms. So with that being said, what you'll notice at the top is a client's name is required along with unit address, unit number, and CaseWorthy ID. When you get into the rent and rent amounts payable, you will notice that there are some key areas where you'll need to fill out. We do encourage that you cover the eligibility expectations of the program with your clients to make sure that they understand the guidelines and program expectations of our program. With initial rent here, this is just the rent amount, the market rate rent that is listed in the lease. This needs to be the same as the lease rent amount. So going back to the lease, whatever is listed here in the terms needs to match the client participation initial rent amount. In terms of rent share, the client rent portion as well as the program admin portion. So this is the client's rent portion. So after you are done calculating the client rent portion in CaseWorthy, you will have access to what the client's rent will be, and that should go here. And whatever the subsidy amount is, that will be included here. Certification statements just go over that the client agrees to the program eligibility. It discusses financial the responsibility reporting financial changes and to adhere to the rules and responsibilities as outlined by the program. So the client and the case manager or staff representative need to complete this section at the bottom. The top one is for the client, so you print and sign as well as date. And then down here, the agency staff member, the case manager, print, sign, and date. And then the last section of the client participation agreement form is the housing discrimination and VAWA disclosure. This section covers it acknowledges that the client has received a copy of the pamphlet, the HUD pamphlet, Are You a Victim of Housing Discrimination? And also will cover that they received a copy of the notice of occupancy rights under the VAWA Act. So case managers must provide these two documents to your clients and review them with the client. And once they've done that, the agency staff member will print and sign as well as date. And then once that happens, the client will also acknowledge that they received these two documents and sign and date here as well. Going back to our checklist here, so the fully executed lease with VAWA addendum we just covered. So we covered the fully executed lease and the information that is needed. We talked about the VAWA lease addendum and all of the areas that need to be completed on that form. We also talked about the proof of income. So clients with income must submit their check stubs, tax and either their check stubs, tax forms, or a current letter by the Social Security Administration office. And clients without income must complete the form, the self-verification form, as well as obtain a letter from Social Security to verify the no income. We also covered the client participation agreement, in which case we did discuss the 4 different areas of the participation agreement, the eligibility, rents and accounts payable, as well as the certification statement and the housing discrimination and VAWA disclosures. We went through and discussed all of the required data elements that are required to be completed and the signatures that are required on page 2 and 3 of the document. The last document that is required for lease submission is the rental assistance landlord contract. This document is the rental assistance landlord contract. This is a contract between the Center for Housing and Health and the landlord. Now, you'll notice that the lease is a contract between the client and the landlord. This is a contract between the center and the landlord. It covers areas around rent and amounts payable in terms of client rent portions and program administrator fees and subsidy amounts. It discusses the terms of the contract as well as security deposit and other key areas in terms of this relationship or contract that will exist under this lease. So we do encourage that you review this as a landlord, or as a case manager, so that if the landlord has any questions, that you're able to respond. So the first areas are information about the landlord. You will need to complete the landlord's name, address, and contact information. It also requires that you enter unit address and unit number, as well as the client or tenant's name. And immediately it requests that you enter the effective date or the date that this was completed. Just like the VAWA addendum, this effective date should also match the beginning of the lease. I'm going to go back. It also explicitly asks for the terms of the contract, and this is just the lease start date and the end date. If security deposit is required, this is the space in which you would enter that information. The security deposit, if there isn't a security deposit, please just put in NA. Moving along further down at the bottom of page 1 in the rent and amounts payable section of this document, just like the client participation agreement, the landlord contract also has the rent, the total month of rent. This is just the market rate rent amount that was listed on the lease. So just to go back and show you, that would be this dollar amount here. You'll also need to complete the client rent portion. So once you've completed the rent calc in CaseWorthy, you will be able to fill this out. And then the subsidy amount. So the program administrator, or what CHH will pay the landlord directly on behalf of the client. So that will get entered here. Some of the other areas, so here, these are all subsections that outline different standards that are required both by the program administrator, CHH, or by the landlord. So things like the housing quality standards, termination of tenancy, fair housing requirements, and so on. As I mentioned, please feel free to review this and get familiar with this document in case there is a question by the landlord. If you have other additional questions that you are not sure, you can always reach out to the center and we will be able to answer those for you. The signature page is the other area of this document that will need to be completed. The top section is just a repeat of the first page, which is just the name of the landlord, the address, email, and phone number, unit address, as well as the client name, but also requires that the landlord, as well as the program administrator, so the case manager or agency staff member, to sign off on the document. So sometimes we know that the landlord may not complete the actual agreement, and that's because it's a larger property management company and there's a representative that is available to complete documents like this. If the landlord is the person who is completing the agreement, you can also just add the landlord's name directly here. Title can just be landlord. But ultimately, every single one of these needs to be completed, as well signed and dated. And the section at the bottom is for the case manager to complete. And finally, we will move on to the landlord documents. So for landlord documents, there is one form that is required regardless of what kind of landlord this client has. So whether it's a small landlord or a big property management company, a completed W-9 form is required. And let me see, I can pull this up. So for the W-9 form, the areas in red are the areas that we want to highlight as areas that need to be completed. So for the landlord name and information, that needs to be in box number 1 and 2. So if there is an in care of, needs to go into box number 2. For number 3, you will identify the tax classification. So if the landlord is an individual person or a sole proprietor, you would select this one. There's corporation, partnership, trust, etc. The landlord will need to check the appropriate box based on their tax status. An area where we often get some pushback, or we do require some revisions, is the address. So landlords must complete box number 5, 6, and 7. This is the address by which the checks will be mailed to. Under Part 1, landlords will be required to include either their Social Security, TIN number, or EIN. If the landlord is an individual, if they marked this box, they will need to complete their Social Security number. If they are anything else, then they would need to complete an EIN, and we'll cover that in just a moment. The other area is that the landlord must sign and date the W-9. This is also an area by which we oftentimes are required to push information back for revisions. Landlord name and in care of information needs to also match what is entered in CaseWorthy, as well as the addresses. So it must be entered exactly as it's written on the W-9. Otherwise, it will be kicked back for revisions. Okay. For property management companies, so these are the larger ones that do not have the tax identification as individual, an EIN letter or a My Tax Illinois verification is required. So let's look at a sample EIN letter. This is a sample EIN letter. So landlords that are a larger property management company are issued this letter by the IRS. It has information about their tax IDs and verification that this is connected to that property management company. So some areas to highlight: one number is required, the number that is here, and this is cross-referenced to what was entered on that W-9. So this EIN here and the EIN information here must match. The name must also match with the W-9. So you want to make sure that these two things are matching what is submitted for the W-9. Additionally, if you're not able to find the EIN, you can also go to My Tax Illinois. It is a public portal that case managers can look up and verify registered businesses like these property management companies. So if you are having a hard time getting an EIN letter from your landlord or property management company, we encourage you to go to mytaxillinois.gov. They do have a portal by which you can verify, and we will just need that verification from the website. Now, for landlords that are marked as individuals, so what does that mean? On the W-9 here, if they selected this first box as an individual, they are required to submit proof of ownership as well as a copy of the Social Security card or TIN number. So for proof of ownership, That could be a deed or tax or water bill, mortgage statement that that gives us proof that this landlord does in fact own the property that is listed. Additionally, we will need a copy of the landlord's Social Security card, and that must match, again, that Social Security that's on the W-9. With that covers all of the documentation that is required for lease submission. Just to recap, for lease documents, there are only 4 required documents: the fully executed lease with the VAWA addendum, the current proof of income or no income, as well as the client participation agreement form and the rental assistance landlord contract. For landlord documents, W-9 is required for both individual landlords and or property management companies. For property management companies, an IRS EIN letter or verification through the tax portal is required. And for individual landlords, tax status of individual, proof of ownership is required, as well as a copy of the landlord's Social Security card. With that covers all of the lease submission documentation. Checklist details will be available directly in CaseWorthy if you want a copy of this checklist and the sample documents. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to check out the unit identification required document of housing unit inspections. Bye-bye.